Your kids need to learn their place. Family gatherings aren't for them to give their 2 cents on everything. My sister-in-law Angela's text glared up at me from my phone screen, her words burning into my vision as I sat alone in my car outside my mother-in-law's sprawling colonial home in Branchville, Connecticut. The message had come last night after I dared to suggest that my son Ethan should be allowed to share his school project during Easter dinner, just as her son Jordan had done at Christmas with his science fair entry. Beneath her message was the thread of our conversation. Me, Ethan's excited to tell everyone about his history project. He worked so hard on it. Angela. Nobody wants to hear about homework during a holiday. Me, Jordan, talked about his science project at Christmas. That was different. Jordan actually won something. Ethan got an A. Angela, your kids need to learn their place. Family gatherings aren't for them to give their 2 cents on everything. I hadn't responded. What was the point? 7 years of marriage into the Walsh family had taught me that Angela was untouchable, her children spotlighted, while mine were expected to remain in the shadows, polite and preferably silent. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as my children Mia and Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, already sensing my tension. They were dressed in their Sunday best. Mia in her navy dress with white collar, Ethan in khakis and a button-down, clothes I'd carefully selected to avoid any criticism. The Easter gathering waited inside, along with the same pattern that repeated at every family event. Angela's children, Jordan and Lily, would dominate every conversation, while my kids would be silenced and shamed if they dared speak up. Remember what we talked about, I said, catching their eyes in the rearview mirror. Best behavior today. It was our pregame ritual before every Walsh family gathering. My children knew the unspoken rules by heart. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't contradict Jordan or Lily. Don't ask for seconds before Angela's kids had been offered them. Don't mention any accomplishments unless directly asked. The rules had emerged gradually, learned through a series of small humiliations that had left invisible bruises on their confidence. 3 Christmases ago, Mia had proudly mentioned her ballet recital solo, only to have Angela cut in with, "Jordan's taking violin lessons from Mrs. Abernathy. She only accepts gifted students, you know." Thanksgiving before last, Ethan's mention of his soccer team's championship was drowned out by Angela's 15-minute monologue about Lily's natural athletic ability and how, the coach says, she's Olympic material. At last year's 4th of July picnic, when both children had answered Beverly's question about their summer reading, Angela had sighed loudly and said, "Let's hear from kids who actually have something interesting to say." Each time, Mark had said nothing. Each time, I'd swallowed my defense, telling myself that family harmony was worth the sacrifice. But watching my children's shoulders slump lower with each gathering, seeing Ethan's stutter return when addressing adults, noticing how Mia had stopped raising her hand in class, according to her teacher, the cost was becoming unbearably clear. "Mom, do we have to go in?" Ethan asked, his voice small and uncertain. At 12, he was old enough to understand the family dynamics. Mia, 9, nodded in agreement, twisting the bracelet on her wrist, a nervous habit she'd developed after last Thanksgiving when Angela had cut her off mid-sentence with a sharp, "Nobody asked for your opinion, sweetie," while the adults laughed uncomfortably. "Just 5 minutes," I whispered to myself before turning to give them a reassuring smile. "It'll be different this time," I promised, knowing it was a lie. Inside, the house buzzed with conversation and the clink of silverware. My husband Mark had gone ahead to help with setup, leaving me to wrangle the kids and my rising anxiety alone. When we entered, Angela's son Jordan was in full performance mode, standing on a dining chair, loudly proclaiming his views on his latest video game, while the adults, including my mother-in-law Beverly, Mark's brother Stephen, and Angela, laughed and encouraged him. "He's going to be a politician someday," Beverly beamed, clapping her hands together. "Such confidence!" Mark approached us with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There you are," he said, kissing my cheek perfunctorily. "Mom's been asking where you were." "We're only 10 minutes late," I responded, helping the kids off with their jackets. Ethan's eyes lit up at the sight of his cousin showing off. He'd been practicing a magic trick all week, hoping to share it today. I watched as he gathered his courage, fingers fidgeting with the deck of cards in his pocket. "I learned something cool too," he said, his voice barely carrying over Jordan's monologue. "I can show you a magic." "Jordan's talking right now," Angela interrupted, her smile sharp as a knife. "Nobody asked you to interrupt, Ethan." I watched my son's shoulders slump as he retreated back toward me, the deck of cards forgotten in his pocket. Mia grabbed his hand, a solidarity forged in shared humiliation. "Actually," I began, feeling heat rise in my cheeks, "Ethan's been practicing." "Rachel, let the kids work it out," Mark said under his breath, his hand on my arm a warning. "Don't make a scene." Mark's voice held the familiar tension that always surfaced around his family. His father had died when he was 15, leaving Beverly to raise him and Stephen alone. In Mark's mind, keeping peace in the family had become a sacred duty, as if challenging the status quo might somehow dishonor his father's memory. He'd explained it to me once, after a particularly rough Thanksgiving 4 years ago, when Angela had criticized Mia's table manners, while Jordan had literally thrown a roll across the table without comment. "My dad's last words to me were to take care of Mom and Stephen," he'd said that night, as we drove home in silence. "Fighting with them doesn't honor that promise." "Standing up for your children does," I'd countered, but he'd turned up the radio, effectively ending the conversation. Now, as I watched Ethan try to make himself invisible beside me, I wondered what lessons he was learning about his worth, about whose voices mattered and whose didn't. What kind of father was Mark modeling for him? What kind of self-advocate was I teaching him to be? I swallowed my defense, the familiar taste of capitulation bitter on my tongue. Mark had always preferred peace to justice, especially when it came to his family. I'd spent 7 years of family gatherings biting my tongue as Angela's kids interrupted, insulted, and dominated while mine were taught their opinions didn't matter. Dinner was the same choreographed dance of inequality. Lily spilled her drink and received sympathetic coos. Minutes later, when Mia accidentally dropped her fork, Angela sighed dramatically about some children needing better table manners. The breaking point came during dessert. Beverly had made her famous apple pie, and as she served it, she asked if anyone wanted ice cream with it. "Yes, please," Mia said, raising her hand politely. Angela clicked her tongue. "Nobody asked for your preference, Mia. You'll take what you're given." But when Jordan shouted, "Extra ice cream for me, Grandma," Beverly laughed indulgently and gave him a double scoop. I saw Mia's eyes fill with tears, and something inside me snapped. The room seemed to narrow to a pinpoint, and 7 years of watching my children being systematically silenced crystallized into a perfect cold clarity. "We're leaving," I announced, standing so abruptly my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "What? Rachel, we haven't even finished dessert," Mark protested, looking embarrassed. "I've had enough," I said, my voice steady despite the rage pulsing through me. "Mia, Ethan, get your coats." "Oh my God, she's so sensitive," Angela stage whispered to Stephen. "It's always drama with her." Beverly frowned. "Rachel, dear, you're overreacting. The children were just being treated completely differently," I cut in, "and it ends today." Mark followed us to the foyer, his face a storm of confusion and anger. "You're embarrassing me," he hissed. "What's gotten into you?" I turned to face him, kids already bundled up and waiting by the door. "What's gotten into me is watching our children be treated like they don't matter, year after year, while you do nothing." "They're just kids, Rachel. It's not that serious." "It is to them," I said, nodding toward Mia and Ethan, who stood watching us with wide eyes. "And it should be to you." In the car, the silence was heavy until Ethan's small voice broke it. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" I met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "No, honey, we're not in trouble. But things are going to change." That night, after the kids were asleep, Mark and I had the first truly honest conversation of our marriage. He accused me of overreacting. I accused him of allowing his family to mistreat our children. When he said I was too sensitive and looking for problems, I knew we had reached a fundamental impasse. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, keeping my voice low so the kids wouldn't wake. "You sound exactly like Angela." "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Mark said, pacing our bedroom. "You take everything so personally. Angela's just direct. That's how she communicates." "She's not direct with her own kids," I pointed out. "She's only direct with ours. And by direct, you mean dismissive and demeaning. Mark ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration I'd seen countless times. You're turning this into some kind of conspiracy. Kids are kids. Sometimes they interrupt each other. Sometimes feelings get hurt. It's normal. What happened today wasn't normal, I insisted. And it wasn't a one-time thing. It's a pattern, Mark. Every single time we're with your family, our children are made to feel less than. They're interrupted, talked over, their achievements minimized, while Jordan and Lily are treated like child prodigies for doing the bare minimum. That's ridiculous, Mark scoffed, but I could see doubt flicker in his eyes. I walked to my desk and pulled out a notebook, the one I'd been keeping for the past year, documenting each instance of differential treatment. I'd started it almost as a sanity check for myself, wondering if I was indeed being oversensitive, as Angela often accused. The entries were brief but specific, dating back to last May. May 30, Memorial Day barbecue. Jordan interrupts Ethan 7 times during dinner. No correction. Ethan asks to speak once. Angela says, "We're talking about grown-up things." July 4th, Beverly praises Lily's artwork for 10 minutes. When Mia shows her drawing, Beverly says, "That's nice, dear," and immediately changes subject. October 31st, Halloween party. Jordan pushes Ethan while bobbing for apples. No consequences. When Ethan accidentally bumps Lily while reaching for candy, Angela makes him sit out games for 30 minutes as punishment. I handed the notebook to Mark. "Read it. All of it. And then tell me I'm being too sensitive." As Mark flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from defensive to troubled. There were over 30 entries, each one a small wound inflicted on our children while he stood by and allowed it. I didn't realize it was so consistent," he finally said, closing the notebook. "I'm taking the kids to my mom's for a few days," I said, already mentally packing our bags. "When I come back, I need you to decide if you're a husband and father first or a son and brother." My mother lived in a modest ranch house in Pinewood, about an hour away. A retired school counselor, she'd always had a special knack for making children feel valued. Within days, I saw Mia and Ethan transform, speaking up more, laughing freely, sharing stories without fear of being shut down. The contrast was striking and heartbreaking. At breakfast the first morning, when my mother asked Ethan what he wanted to eat, he'd looked at me first, seeking permission to answer. When Mia accidentally knocked over her water glass, she'd immediately tensed, eyes darting to the adults, clearly anticipating criticism that never came. By day 3, Ethan was volunteering stories about school without being prompted, and Mia had started talking about a book she was reading without prefacing it with, "I know it's not interesting, but..." "Do you see the difference?" my mother asked quietly on our 4th evening after the kids had gone to bed. We sat on her back porch, the April air still crisp enough to require sweaters, watching fireflies emerge in the growing darkness. "It's like they're different children here." "They're the children they actually are," I corrected, sipping my tea. "At home, they're the children they've been trained to be." My mother had never been one to mince words, a trait I'd inherited, but had somehow suppressed in my marriage. "You should have done this years ago," she said, as we watched a particularly bold firefly hover near the porch light. "Those people have been crushing their spirits." "I know," I admitted, the weight of my complacency heavy on my shoulders. But I kept hoping Mark would stand up for them, for us. "Men like Mark," my mother said carefully, "sometimes need to see what they stand to lose before they find their courage." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the notebook I'd shown Mark, about all the small moments of injustice I documented. But what haunted me more were all the moments I hadn't written down. The times before I'd started keeping track, the subtle diminishments I'd missed, the damage that had already been done. My children had been taught, systematically and consistently, that their voices weren't as important as their cousins. What would that mean for them as they grew older? How would it shape their future relationships, their sense of self-worth, their willingness to stand up for themselves? I got out of bed and went to check on them, finding comfort in their peaceful sleep. Mia had kicked off her covers as usual, one arm flung dramatically over her head. Ethan was curled into a tight ball, his favorite position since infancy. They deserved better than what they'd been getting. They deserve better than what I'd been allowing. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Mark, alternating between anger and pleas for us to come home. Beverly called twice to tell me I was tearing the family apart over nothing. Angela sent a group text to the family declaring that I was mentally unstable and needed help. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I contacted a family therapist and made an appointment for when we returned. I also started journaling every instance of differential treatment I could remember, creating a document I titled Patterns on my laptop. On day 5, Mark showed up at my mother's doorstep. He looked tired, his usual confident posture replaced by something more uncertain. "Can we talk?" he asked, hands shoved deep in his pockets. We sat on my mother's porch swing, the April evening still holding winter's chill. "I've been thinking about what you said," Mark began, staring at his shoes. "About the kids being treated differently. I didn't want to see it because—" He trailed off. "Because it would mean confronting your family," I finished for him. He nodded. "My mom always favored Stephen. Angela's just following the pattern." "That doesn't make it okay," I said firmly. "Our kids deserve better." "I know," he admitted. "I just don't know how to fix it." I pulled out my phone and showed him the therapist's information. "We start here, together, and then we set boundaries with your family." Mark agreed to therapy, but I could tell he still hoped this would all blow over without major confrontation. I knew better. This wasn't just about one Easter dinner. It was about years of subtle and not-so-subtle messages that my children's voices didn't matter. In our first therapy session, Dr. Winters listened as we laid out the situation. Mark downplayed certain incidents. I refused to let him gloss over the pattern. By the end of the hour, even Mark had to admit there was a problem that needed addressing. Boundaries are healthy, Dr. Winters emphasized, and they're especially important when children are involved. Over the next few weeks, we developed a plan. We would return to family gatherings, but with clear conditions. Any disrespect toward our children would result in us leaving immediately. Mark would take the lead in addressing his family, showing a united front. "They're not going to like this," Mark warned as we drove to his mother's house for a Sunday dinner in May, our first family event since Easter. "They don't have to like it," I replied. "They just have to respect it." Beverly greeted us with brittle cheer, her smile not reaching her eyes. Angela and Stephen arrived minutes later, their children immediately dominating the space with loud demands for attention. The dynamic was immediately apparent. When Jordan interrupted Ethan's story about his science project, I saw Mark stiffen beside me. But before either of us could speak, Beverly jumped in. "Let Ethan finish, Jordan," she said with surprising firmness. "Everyone gets a turn." Angela's mouth fell open in shock, and I caught Beverly shooting me a nervous glance. It seemed Mark had already had a conversation with his mother, one I hadn't been privy to. Throughout dinner, there was a palpable tension, but also a subtle shift. When Mia offered her opinion on the new playground at school, no one told her to be quiet. When Ethan asked to be excused, Beverly acknowledged him directly instead of talking over him. After dinner, while the kids played in the yard, Beverly pulled me aside. "Mark talked to me," she said, her voice low. He said I've been unfair to your children." I nodded, unwilling to soften the truth. "Yes, you have." "I didn't see it that way," she continued, wringing her hands. "I just thought Angela's kids were more outgoing." "They were allowed to be," I corrected. "Mine were taught to shrink." Beverly's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to lose my grandchildren, Rachel, or Mark, or you." "Then things need to change," I said simply. "Not just for one dinner, but permanently." Angela, however, wasn't going down without a fight. As we prepared to leave, she cornered me in the hallway. "So you've got Beverly wrapped around your finger now," she hissed. "Playing the victim must be working out well for you." "I'm not playing anything, Angela," I replied evenly. "I'm just making sure my kids are treated with the same respect as yours." "Please," she scoffed. "You're just jealous that my kids have personality while yours are forgettable." The old me would have retreated, swallowed the insult to keep the peace. The new me felt a cold resolve settle in my chest. "If that's how you really feel," I said, pulling out my phone, "would you mind repeating that to the group?" Her eyes widened as she realized I'd been recording our conversation. A perfectly legal move in Connecticut, a one-party consent state. You wouldn't dare, she whispered. Try me, I challenged. I've spent years watching you tear down my children while everyone pretended not to notice. Those days are over. The next family gathering was Memorial Day at Stephen and Angela's place in Newfield. I almost didn't want to go, but Mark insisted it was important to maintain our new boundaries consistently. When we arrived, Angela was noticeably subdued. She barely acknowledged me, but didn't make any snide comments toward the kids either. The afternoon progressed with an uneasy peace until Jordan knocked over Maya's carefully constructed card house and laughed about it. Jordan, apologize to your cousin right now, Stephen said sharply, surprising everyone. But Dad, it was just. Now, Jordan, Stephen insisted, and the boy reluctantly mumbled an apology. Angela's face flushed red. Since when do we police every little thing the kids do? She demanded of her husband. Since I realized we've been letting our kids get away with being disrespectful, Stephen replied firmly. Mark showed me some videos from Christmas and Thanksgiving. I didn't like what I saw. My eyes shot to Mark, who gave me a small nod. He'd been building his own case, it seemed, gathering evidence just as I had. The summer brought a gradual shift in the family dynamics. Beverly made visible efforts to engage equally with all her grandchildren. Stephen became more attentive to Jordan and Lily's behavior. Even Angela, though initially resistant, began to modify her approach when she realized she was increasingly isolated in her favoritism. In late August, we hosted a back-to-school barbecue at our house. As I watched Ethan confidently showing his magic tricks to an attentive audience of adults and children, and Mia leading her cousins in a game she'd invented, I felt a deep satisfaction. My children were blossoming, their voices growing stronger with each passing day. Mark joined me on the deck, slipping an arm around my waist. You were right, he said quietly. I should have done something years ago. We're doing something now, I replied. That's what matters. The real test came at Thanksgiving. Beverly had insisted on hosting despite her recent hip surgery, unwilling to break tradition. The usual tension I felt driving to her house was absent, replaced by a cautious optimism. Inside, the scene was unlike any previous holiday. Beverly had assigned seats at the table, alternating the cousins so that the usual factions couldn't form. She'd also created cards with conversation prompts, ensuring everyone, including the children, had a chance to speak. I asked each of you to prepare something to share about what you're thankful for. Beverly announced as we settled in. We'll go around the table, and everyone gets 2 minutes without interruption. Angela caught my eye across the table, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of understanding pass between us. We weren't friends, and might never be, but something fundamental had shifted. When it was Mia's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She stood, a little nervously, and unfolded a paper she'd pulled from her pocket. I'm thankful for my voice, she read clearly, and for my mom, who helped me find it again. My eyes filled with tears as Beverly reached over to squeeze my hand. Around the table, I saw various expressions. Mark's pride, my mother's vindication, Angela's discomfort, Stephen's thoughtfulness. But most importantly, I saw my children sitting tall, unafraid to take up space. Later that evening, as we prepared to leave, Beverly pulled me into a hug. You did the right thing, she whispered, even if it was hard for all of us at first. In the car, Ethan fell asleep almost immediately, the emotional day having exhausted him. Mia leaned forward from the back seat. Mom? Are we going to come back for Christmas? I met Mark's eyes briefly before answering. Yes, we are. And your voice will be heard there too. Cool, she said, settling back. I think Grandma Beverly's finally listening. As we drove home through the quiet Connecticut streets, past houses lit up for the coming holiday season, I reflected on the journey of the past 7 months. I hadn't set out for revenge. I'd simply wanted justice for my children. In the end, we'd achieved something more valuable, a reformed family dynamic that allowed everyone, especially the youngest members, to be seen and heard. Angela would probably never fully change her ways, but she'd learned there were consequences to her behavior. Beverly had recognized her role in perpetuating the inequality, and Mark had finally stepped up as a father, protecting our children's right to exist fully in all spaces, even uncomfortable family ones. But most importantly, Mia and Ethan had learned a lesson I hoped would serve them for life, that their voices mattered. that injustice should be confronted rather than endured, and that sometimes the quietest revolution can bring the most profound change. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed Mia had fallen asleep too. In the rearview mirror, her face looked peaceful, unburdened. I'd spent years trying to protect my children by teaching them to be small, to avoid rocking the boat. Now I understood that true protection meant teaching them to stand their ground, even when, especially when it was difficult. "We did good," Mark said softly, reaching for my hand across the console. "Yes," I agreed, squeezing his fingers. "We did.